So today we've got three areas we're going to cover. So we'll start off talking about the Community Ownership Fund. We're then going to delve into a bit of depth on community shares, and I'm aware some people will have various levels of experience on community shares. And then we'll pick up briefly about additional support that exists beyond the Community Ownership Fund for preparing share offers in the different nations across the UK. So before we start, I thought it would be useful for us to gauge where everyone is at and how used to community shares people are, how used to the Community Ownership Fund people are. So I'm just going to change the screen. And we have a little poll, which hopefully you'll be able to see now. So this is an interactive poll, which does require a bit of thinking and a bit of action if that's okay with people. So we're using something called Mentimeter. If you go to that website and there is a code, if I click onto the next slide, hopefully you can all see this. So there is a code there, 51910305, or you should be able to scan that QR code as well. And we're just going to ask a couple of questions to see where people today are at when it comes to the Community Ownership Fund and community shares. So I'll just give you a few more seconds. You can do this on your phone if it's easier. You should be able to scan that code. You should be able to go to that website on your phone, or if you're on a computer, you can do it on there as well. The code and the link will stay at the top as I progress through these as well, so don't worry if you think you've missed it. And we should get the scores coming in fairly live. So we're asking, how familiar are you today with community shares? Okay, these are going up and down as we speak. This is very good. Okay, I think most people have voted now. It keeps changing. It's like a few people have very honestly said, I'm not sure, which is good. Okay, so we've got a real range of people from not familiar at all with it to being pretty familiar, and a couple of people saying they're not really sure. So that's great to have a real range of experience in the room. If you want to ask any questions as well in the chat, do please pop them in there. So second question, hopefully you can see this on your screens. This asks you about the legal structure of any organisation that you work with. So are you already a community benefit society or a cooperative society? And okay, oh, one person's not sure, that's okay. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you currently aren't already in one of those structures. And the reason we ask that is you do need to be in one of those legal structures in order to use community shares, but that doesn't mean you can't convert into that structure. So that's really interesting that I think yes has gone up and down, but it seems the majority is at no. Okay, we've just got two more questions. So this is asking, have you ever run a share offer? Have you ever bought community shares? Have you already applied to the Community Share Ownership Fund, or are you thinking of applying pretty soon? So I think you should be able to answer more than once here. So there may be an opportunity to tick more than one box. Okay, the majority of you are thinking of applying to the Community Ownership Fund pretty soon. A couple of you have already done it. It's good to see we've got some experienced people who've actually bought community shares, as well as people who have run a share offer. So that's really good to see. And then finally, this is where you have to actually type, but we're asking what is it you might be interested in getting out of this webinar, and hopefully that will give us just a little gauge to see what people are coming to the webinar to find out more about. So if you can just type in any answers, they should appear on the screen. Okay, so we've got lots of answers there. If we start at the top, which is a quick look through these, understanding more about community shares, no knowledge, basic understanding, learn more about the community ownership fund. I want to know if there's a way forward for our project, further information. Okay, something about the process. What information should I include in a share offer document? Okay, some basic knowledge to understand the better benefits and how to develop a community ownership structure. Key elements of scheme design, best practice in delivery, financial and technical support, how to apply to the community ownership fund, hints and tips. I'm new to this model from a charity sector, but now work for a co-op. Okay, great. Well, there's loads of really useful bits of insight there. Hopefully we'll cover most of those. And if we don't, we'll be very keen to and happy to answer any questions as we progress through this, or even afterwards, if that's an easier way of doing it. Now, I'm just trying to change back screen. Hopefully that's now come up. So thank you for that level of interaction. That was really good. So the Community Ownership Fund, the fund goals of the Community Ownership Fund are around supporting community groups to take ownership of assets which are at risk. And the at risk is quite a key element of the fund. It's about supporting community groups where the asset is already in community ownership, but it needs essential renovations. So the building can already be in community ownership. It doesn't have to just be at risk from not being in community ownership, but it might be at risk still because it needs essential renovations. The government's also talking about it as a method of strengthening community ownership and social infrastructure in communities. I've put a link there and you can follow that link afterwards when we send around the slides, but that gives you details of the prospectus, which has all the fund guidance in it. So other criteria is, this is very focused on assets or buildings, if you will. So purchase of a freehold, or you need a minimum of a 15-year lease with break clauses that are reasonable within that don't limit the ability of you to have access to that building for the long term. So this is about longer term.
I'm doing a seminar right now. I'm in the just
Rose, I think you're Rose.
Can
you mute you, please, Rose?
Sorry?
Do you have a tea?
I don't have that one, thank you.
I've just muted Rose for a moment. So applications are generally over £250,000. Sorry, applications are generally up to £250,000. They have now extended it to beyond £250,000, but they're saying that you need a strong strategic case for funding. They have made a couple of awards over £250,000, but they are certainly not the norm. And you can't buy assets from the public sector, but you can transfer them and you can refurbish them using community ownership fund money. So a slight technicality there, but you can buy assets from the private sector. So the community ownership fund talks about the information that you need to put in a application. So that includes a business plan, it includes the financial breakdown of your project, about how the asset will be used and managed in the future, talks about understanding what the risks are. So that's both at the capital stage and the ongoing operation of the building. And then they want to know about any systems you've got, your governance processes that are in place. If you're looking to purchase an asset, they'll be wanting to see that you've got some sort of professional valuation in place, that the asset purchase price that you're considering is reasonable, or if you're looking to lease it, that you've got details of a lease agreement. So that might be heads of terms, for instance. And just to say really that if you're looking at community shares, all of this information would likely to be needed for a community share offer as well. And often people have started to prepare a lot of this information for a community share offer. So by the time of a community ownership fund application, you're in a fairly strong place already with a lot of this information in place. So the process of applying is that you need to complete an expression of interest form, and these are open all the time. If you pass expression of interest, you receive a link to the full application form. If you've received one of these in the past, you don't need to keep submitting EOIs. If you are unsuccessful, you now can keep reapplying, whereas in the past that wasn't quite the case. And this is a £150 million fund. It's due to be open until March 2025. So just to give you a little idea of the process. So once you've submitted an expression of interest, it's followed by a full application form, and that falls into two areas where they're looking to assess your application. So that's around the strategic case and the management case. And you can see the bullet points there of the sorts of things they're looking for, the sorts of questions they'll be asking you about. That's reviewed against the assessment criteria. And I think the assessment criteria is a really useful document to look at how the people assessing the applications, what information they're looking for, what framework it is that they're assessing against. Those are whittled down to a shortlist. That shortlist is then balanced out across different sectors against different geographies. If you are successful, a grant funding agreement is put in place. You then need the match funding to be in place to draw down the money. You don't necessarily need it in place to bid, and you have 12 months. They talk about to draw down the money. So you do need to think about timescales of when you're going to raise the match funding and when it might be possible to buy the building. So if there are things there like planning permission, or if it's going to take a long time to purchase the building, then you might need to think about getting those in place. So the next window does close in a couple of days' time, so you might be pushing it a bit tight to apply at this window, but we're expecting future rounds, probably around 4 rounds each year. So we're expecting the next round probably to open up fairly shortly after this one closes, and have a similar sort of window of time to submit your application. But don't forget, you can put an expression of interest at any point. And there is now additional support available through this new support provider process. That's all listed on the My Community website there. You can see the link. But that now has an inquiry service. It has lots of stories of grantees to date, so case studies of successful applicants. There's the past webinars that have been put up there as recordings. There is additional guidance, and what is quite useful is an editable version of the application form as well. So just to give you a little flavour of how the fund has progressed, it's been open now for 2 years. As I said, it was a £150 million UK-wide fund. There's almost £37 million allocated to about 150 projects so far. And the awards have ranged from pretty small, 34k, up to a few awards at £1 million. And you can see the spread there across England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. So the government is keen that it is spread out across the nations. All the bidders are published online as well. So if you're interested in seeing some successful bidders and see who they are, you can see them on the government website as well if you just search for all these. So the Community Ownership Fund Support Programme has resources on the website. As I said, it's got the advice service. There is also some in-depth support packages, so pre-bidding support packages being allocated to organisations with additional support needs. So if this is something you're interested in, have a look at the My Community website. There will be a bit more information about that there, but advisor support can be put in place to organisations to help them bid and get ready to bid to the Community Ownership Fund. Okay, I think we've covered most of this. Second and third point there, so you do need match funding, and that used to be 50%. That's now been dropped to 20%, or 10% in exceptional cases. And while you can bid for up to £250,000 in capital costs, so that's things like buying a physical building, you can also, which is really helpful, apply for up to £50,000 in revenue funding. So these are costs to help you pay for staff, or to pay for working cash flow, to get the propositions, get the organisation up and running, which is really valuable on top of the capital money as well. So when I say that you need around 20% plus of match funding, what sort of match funding might you consider? Well, the prospectus talks about in-kind support. and it mentions there are certain types of in-kind support that they are open to accepting as match funding. So that includes the donations of goods. So maybe some building products might be donated to you, perhaps bricks or something, to help with the build costs if you're looking at refurbishing an asset. Professional services can count as in-kind support. So if you have a solicitor that's carrying out some work, as long as the professional services are invoiceable, so there's an evidence trail there that you can present to the funder that certain value of services has been provided. And they will look at any professionally valued discount of a lease or freehold. So if you're looking to take on an asset from a local authority, you can't buy it off the local authority, but you may be able to negotiate a long-term lease at, say, a peppercorn rent, and you may then be able to get a valuer to value what that lease could be worth and use that as match funding. You can obviously look at other grant funding, and lots of organisations are doing this. One challenge is looking at the funder timescales. You can look at loan finance, and again, people have often used this as like a bit of a top up or a bit of a fallback option. We are seeing, though, as wouldn't be surprised to anyone who's following the news, that interest rates are increasing substantially on even secured lending. So that is increasing the cost of loan finance for a lot of organisations, and the risk appetite perhaps of lenders would reflect some of that as well. You could look at donations. Some organisations have managed to accumulate reserves from over the years, which they are using as part of their match funding. And finally, which we'll be focusing on a bit more today, is community shares. But I think it is also worth saying that generally most applicants aren't using just one of these. They'll be looking at putting together a bit of a cocktail of at least two or more of these as a means of progressing. So this does say, the guidance from departments, applicants are not required to have all match funding sources secured at the time of your application, which is really helpful. However, you must set out clear and realistic plans to secure match funding in your business plan. And as we said earlier, you will need to have it in place in order to draw down the funding if you are successful. And I think this is one of the real challenges that people have got. It's quite chicken and egg, going to the community ownership fund, saying we're definitely going to raise our match funding from elsewhere, and going elsewhere saying we're definitely going to raise money from the community ownership fund. So people are having to walk that fine line of how much they're getting secured and committed from which places. So I'll pause there because I know a few questions have come in, and I'll just look through some of the questions. How long is the window? I think this current window has been a couple of months, so you do get a bit of time to submit. So it's sort of 4 to 8 weeks, and it's an online application system. How do you draw down funding? After expenditure or in anticipation of expenditure? I think it'd be worth looking at the guidance there, and that's likely to evolve as well. We have heard that some applicants were only allowed to draw down the funding after they've made expenditure, but that doesn't seem to strictly be the case for everyone. So have a look through the guidance, and also if you get to the stage of being awarded the funding, then do have discussions with your contacts at the department, and if it's going to be a challenge, which it often is, about trying to cash flow those things and really make those cases to them as well. I see we've also got a few questions in the question and answer box. Rose, I wonder if you might pick up some of these as well as we're going through these. So we've got a question.
Will do.
Thank you, Rose. I have the council buy-in, but they would need to redo the lease 15 years. Does this need to happen before we start an expression of interest? I would say no, but I think what you do need is confidence that the council will be there to offer you a 15-year lease at least. And if you can get at least a heads of terms by the time of an application, I think that's going to put you in a much stronger position than if you haven't. And then Chris has said, as match funding support, do we believe the value of a rent-free period on a 25-year lease would count as in kind, obviously valued and compared against any rent-free period that would be offered to any commercial leases? Well, I think you need to look at the guidance there, and if you can get that valued, the guidance talks about having a professional valuation. So it may be possible if you put in that there's you've had a valuation of what that lease would be worth, that you could count that as much funding. You can also submit questions to the My Community service as well if you've got very specific questions like that. And then final one from Maria: the organisation I work with is already on a peppercorn rent. Would this still count as match funding if we get professional valuation? So I think that's a similar question. So I'll revert back to my similar answer. Yeah, I think that could be possible to count that. But again, I would check with both the fund guidance and perhaps the inquiry service just to see their take on that. Okay, we'll move on to the next section, which is about moving on to look at community shares. So why might someone consider community shares? Why might you be here today thinking about community shares? Well, as we've said, the Community Ownership Fund needs match funding. So that's around 20%. And what we found that community ownership funds, what we found that the community shares can provide is at the moment, so at the time of bidding for community ownership fund, if you go down the community shares route, it really does help you to build community buy-in. It gives you a lot of very decent evidence that you've consulted, you've spoken to the community. It gives very good live market research, as it were, that there's support for your proposal. If you're able to turn around and say, we're considering a community share offer, we've had this many people interested in buying shares. I think that's a really strong case to put to funders. We know that going through a community shares process is quite a rigorous process, but it has a positive outcome in that it helps you to develop a really rigorous business plan. It helps you to develop really strong financial forecasts, and it can help you to develop a really strong case to put to other funders, which then strengthens other funding bids. So at the time of bidding, community shares can be really beneficial. But it also, as a longer term mechanism, talks here about it being a bit future-proofing of your applications, but future-proofing of you as an organisation as well. So I think if you are able to bid to the Community Ownership Fund and say that we are going to use community shares, it really shows that the community is going to back the facility, but also it's going to continue to use it in the long term, because if local people have bought community shares, it's in their interest to keep that organisation going. And I think that will really help you to evidence that you've thought about the long term, that you've got a contribution there towards the ongoing sustainability and viability of the organisation, that you've thought ahead. Community shares is also unrestricted. It's also unsecured funding. So unlike loan funding, it isn't secured against the assets. Unlike grant funding, which might specify it has to be used on a certain thing, it is unrestricted. You can use it how you want, although you ought to use it how you say you're going to use it in your share offer documents. It is flexible money as well. We often talk about it as being very patient money. So it is equity. Technically, it's equity finance. It's withdrawable share capital rather than loans or grants. And it's down to the members to decide when it comes to an AGM, and it's down to the directors to decide how profitable the organisation has been. So how much interest they might be able to pay, how much withdrawals they might be able to make available. So it is quite different to loan finance and grant finance in that way. And we're seeing it now as a very recognised and established route. Community shares is mentioned in the prospectus as one of the routes that people might want to use for match funding. We've also seen the first few rounds of the Community Ownership Fund, around a third of awardees were using community shares, which is probably not a great surprise because it was quite a strong way of attracting that additional finance to use as your match funding. So these quotes are just based from some research we did a while ago, but asking what impact community shares has had on the performance of your organisation. And you can just see here that people are finding community shares to be a really useful form of finance as well. So Equal Care Co-op, they're talking about having a network of many people who want us to succeed and thrive. Bridgend talking about the engagement with members and how they're involved with decision making. And Ford Hall Farm there as well, talking about the membership, the leverage it's helping to create to attract additional investment as well. Put at the bottom, we call this the community competitive advantage, but taking on loan finance or grant finance doesn't really build you a user base or a customer base. Taking on community shares means you have an active membership of individuals, generally fairly closely located to your business, and they're the people who really want it to thrive and succeed because it's on their doorstep. So it really is in their interest to continue trading with that organisation. So it is quite different from grants and loans in that aspect as well. So for any of you wondering what community shares are, we've got a nice picture of the Lowther Arms up in Cumbria here, but technically they're a flexible form of raising equity investments and building a membership. It's unique to cooperative and community benefit societies, so you do need to be in that legal form. They are withdrawable rather than transferable share capital. So they aren't speculative. They don't reflect every single characteristic of shares bought in a private company. So they don't necessarily, well, they don't go up in value, and they aren't really tradable on any exchange. But individuals who buy shares can apply to the society to withdraw them in due course. So they do work slightly differently. They're democratic, and that's different to shares in a private company as well, where if I hold 90% of the shares in the private company, I'd hold 90% of the votes. With community shares, you have one vote regardless of how much money you put in. So they are a much more balanced and democratic way of spreading ownership across the community. We mentioned they're patient and flexible, but also you set the terms. If you go to a lender, they will come back to you with an offer based on their calculation of risk and based on their ability to attract money to themselves. So you'll be lumped with any interest rate that they might come back to you with, say 8 or 9%. If you go to a grant funder, they'll come back to you with their reams of restrictions on how you can use the money and how much evidence and reporting you need to provide. With community shares, it is quite different. So you effectively consult the community, and the interest rate that you might set on the community shares by legislation only has to be as much as you need to attract the interest. To attract the investment. So you can offer different interest rates, lower interest rates to what you might get from loan finance. And at the moment, I think we are seeing interest rates on community shares to be significantly lower than secured borrowing. And community shares, it should be remembered, they are an investment. So while they're a form of crowdfunding, they are an investment rather than a donation. We expect community shares to be paid back in due course. And that recycling of capital is really important. And they are a mechanism of embedding collective ownership. Okay, got just a picture of Farfield Mill in Sedbergh there in Suffolk, who also carried out a share offer. But why are people using community shares? They're a resilient business model. So our research has found that around 92% of organisations who've launched a community share offer are still trading. And that compares very, very favourably with the commercial sector and commercial startups. And I think the fact that you've got a local bought-in investor base from your community is really helpful in terms of the sustainability and viability of the model. It attracts other investments. So our research has found for every £1 that you raise in community shares, on average, organisations are attracting an additional £1.18 of other investment, be that through loan or grant investments. And increasingly, we're seeing that community shares are a really compelling story. So we're seeing more and more coverage in national papers of great stories of communities coming together and doing things for themselves and saving assets, starting up new societies. But we found that around 80% of people are investing because of the wider social and environmental benefits. So this isn't just a financial instrument. It is not just people investing to make money locally, but it's people investing because they want to make their communities a better place. And in the last decade, we've seen £216 million raised in community shares. So that's from 135,000 investors across the country, 730 offers. And we have something called the Community Shares Standard Mark, which is an external verification and assessment of a community share offer document. We've had over 250 of those as well. If you want to find out a bit more about any of these stats, we released back in January a report giving an overview of where the community shares market has got in the last decade. But we've really seen it grow from quite a fringe activity to much more of a mainstream activity of communities raising finance to invest in assets, to develop facilities for developing communities. So back in 2015, there was a real rush for community energy projects, as there was an incentive on how much electricity prices could be paid for. So it really drove the community energy market. Since then, you can see a much more balanced picture of who's using community shares. So back in 2021 was around the height of the More Than a Pub programme. We had a lot of community pubs launched that year, but still a number of energy projects, a lot of community hubs, shops, a real growth in community housing as well. I think the main thing here to say really is there's a real variety of business models that are using community shares, as well as a real breadth of communities across the country that are now using community shares. And it does look a lot different to it did, say, 10 or so years ago. So when it comes to developing a community share offer, there are various stages you'd want to look at, and there are various pieces of documentation you'd need to pull together. So the main bits really are you need to be registered as a society. You need to check what your legal constitution says, and the constitution of a society is what is technically called the rules of the society, and they would be lodged and registered at the FCA. You can look up society's records on there as well. So they're registered there rather than at Companies House or the Charity Commission. So you need to just make sure that your rules are in the right order in order to be able to offer community shares. You need to develop a business model, and that business model is something you can discuss with your community, you can discuss with the team that are preparing the community share offer document, and that would then turn into a very detailed business plan. And then you often see alongside a business plan something called a share offer document. And that is much more of a glossy publication. It's more of a summary of what the proposition is. So this is giving the key terms of what the investments are, who's making the investment, what the timescales are, how much you're looking to raise, what the minimum amounts of investment might be, whether there's any interest offered on the share offer itself as well. And you'd also need to think about the system and process you're going to use in terms of attracting community shares. So whether you're going to use an online platform, and people often use platforms like Crowdfunder or FX, which you might have come across. And a lot of people don't use a platform and they do it offline themselves. Traditionally, people use things like checks and just asking people to mail in checks and have an application form. So all of these things, there's quite a few bits to develop when it comes to preparing a community share offer, but that's why we said at the start that community share offers do help you to develop a really strong proposition to take to other funders, because you're going through a very rigorous process of developing this information. And I think the important thing here is these are people that you're going to bump into on the street. They're people you're going to stand side by side in shops or pubs locally. So you want to make sure that you've got your numbers right. You want to make sure that you've got as much evidence there as possible, that you've got things in as good a shape as possible. And we talk really about making sure that share offer documents are clear and they're not in any way confusing, but that the proposition is there for everyone to see clearly. Now, we know a lot of people don't necessarily read the business plans in full detail, but the likes of assessors for things like the Community Ownership Fund or a few small people in your community will probably pore all over a business plan and make sure it stacks up. I think people will tend to look at share offer documents in more detail. People don't necessarily read your rules, but you need to make sure that you are doing that right. And you can see on the screen in front of you, the first pillar there we talk about is community engagement. And when you're at the early stages of thinking about a community share offer, it's really important that idea of building a membership locally. So I think where some share offers fall down is where they haven't done enough community engagement at the early stage. So it is really worth spending a bit of time talking to people locally, finding out, do they share your enthusiasm for this proposition? Are they likely to go and use that facility? Is this something they would be interested in investing in? Do they have different use cases for that building? So you might be looking at it from one perspective, they might have some really insightful thoughts on how it could be used differently. And I mentioned the community shares standard mark. So this is something that we can help you to access here at Cooperatives UK. So this is a standard mark we've developed to help community share offers reach a minimum standard. And when people invest in community shares, it is unregulated. It's an unregulated investment. There isn't really any comeback when people make investments. So it's not like investing in a private company, which is much more regulated. It's not like investing on the stock market. So as a means of trying to uphold the quality and the standards of community share offer documents, we've developed this standard. And we've seen a real growth in communities using this standard. And it has really helped to develop much better share offer documentation. So that it's much clearer for individuals looking to make investments. So we have a number of practitioners. So these are people we've trained up who understand the ins and outs, the legalities of community shares. We have people who can help you to prepare a community share offer document. So they will have prepared these in the past and they will bring their expertise and knowledge to help you look at how you prepare the documents, what documents you need, what evidence you need to put in there. And then we have separate people who can award the community shares standard. And this standard mark is the logo in the middle. If that's stamped on your share offer document, it does help to give investors a bit of reassurance that it's had an external pair of eyes go over the standard mark. As part of that process, there's usually a number of questions asked and a number of recommendations suggested on how to improve a share offer. And because they are detailed things, it is worth going down this route because that external set of eyes picking up things that the first people haven't necessarily looked at can be really, really valuable. And the assessment looks at the governing document of the organisation, it looks at the business plan, it looks at the share offer document, it also looks at how you propose to collect money, how you propose to keep that safe. But it looks at the numbers as well and the forward-looking financial projections that you create. Okay, if we just move on to look at how much people are raising in community shares. So the data that we track, and we've tracked the data for the last decade, puts the average investment raised at about 335,000, which might be skewed slightly, but from some of the much larger community energy offers that have raised over £1 million. The average number of investors there from our data is around 367 as well. And Plunkett Foundation, this is one of their reports, a really good read if you're interested in community pubs. So they tracked 15 community pubs in 2021, which raised almost 4 million. So the average raise there was about 276,000 and a real range. So one pub raised 80,000, one raised 600,000, so quite a difference there. And you can see that a couple of them had really strong levels of investors, so over 1,000 investors. And if you're getting to that level of investors, you do need to think about how you're going to manage those investors as well. So you need to think, how do we have a system in place so we can track all those individuals' payments, we can track their contact details, we can track who is owed what interest on which investment they've made. If you use one of the platforms, sometimes they can do this for you, or we have something called Air Register, which we can put you in touch with, which can help you manage your registry of investees as well. A few other examples here. So these are all examples which Cooperatives UK has supported through our Community Shares Booster Fund, which operates in England. So the Friends of the Joiners Arms is an LGBT plus venue in London. They raised 128,000, but from 2,260 investors. So a really unusually large number of investors there. And a lot of community share offers are very place-based, very geographic-based. They also tapped into the LGBT plus community there as well. So they did get investments from much further afield than you perhaps might normally see. The Ultimate Picture Palace in Oxfordshire, they raised £367,000, again, a very large number of investors. And then Exchange Erith raised 79,000, but that was part of a much bigger heritage funded project to take on a Carnegie library. This was a couple of years ago from the local authority. The library was fairly run down and disused by the council. So local residents walking past it got frustrated and decided they wanted to take it on and rejuvenate it. They've subsequently done that with a lot of heritage money, but with community share money as well. And they also used, because they wanted to turn it into an arts venue, they've also used a lot of makers, a lot of creative people locally to come in to rejuvenate the building, to put in woodwork, to design furniture that's in there as well. So they've also found ways of getting in-kind donations, as it were, to contribute towards the ongoing renovation of their building. So if we just have a think about how you might reach people, when it comes to preparing a community share offer, one of the things you need to decide is what is your minimum investment amount. And this can be anything from £1 upwards, but people usually go for something like 50, 100, 200, 250 pounds as the minimum investment. So you're saying, in order to invest in this community share offer, we would like you to make this much as a minimum investment amount. Balancing that is quite a careful calibration, because it's a real balance between how many people might be put off because you've put the investment level too high against how much do you need to raise. And if you feel that a number of investors might only put in the minimum investment amount and you set the minimum investment amount fairly low, you might feel you might struggle to reach the amounts that you want to raise. We have seen some, and increasingly we see more of this, communities differentiate this by geography, by age, by other characteristics. So we've seen one recently where they've said we'll reduce the minimum investment amount for people under 35 or with a blue badge, so people with disability. We often see people say that anyone living within these postcodes can have a smaller minimum investment amount because their interest is in building a movement as much as raising the investment. Beyond those postcodes, they would have an increase in investment. In the last few years, we've seen more organisations, including the Joiners Arms, set up pay it forward schemes, so you can encourage investors in your community to donate a community share, as it were. So if your minimum investment is £100 and someone pays £200, they can nominate £100 of that to be paid forward to someone who couldn't afford to buy community shares, and then that is managed by the society, and that those shares are donated to someone else in the community. We've seen people use instalment mechanisms, so as a way of encouraging people to pay over a longer time scale. So Stretford Public Hall were one of the first to do this. Their minimum investment was £100, but they encouraged people to make instalments of £10 over 10 months. And they had a large number of people who actually did that. I think they had a very small drop off, if any, of individuals who didn't make the payments to make up the full 100 amounts. Community share offers can offer interest rates, and that is an interest rate on the amounts invested. Sometimes some societies say, would you like to donate your interest back to the organisation, or would you like to take a different interest rate to that offered? So you can manage things differently that way as well, although that does increase the complexity of who's being paid what. People obviously, when it comes to trying to grow their reach, look at launch events, they look at social media. Increasingly, a lot of community share offers are picked up by national media. We've seen some really good coverage and high profile community share offers recently. Community share offers tend to be quite visible things. they tend to be very people focused. They make good stories for the local news. So do make sure you keep any kind of local news services involved with what you're doing. Whether or not you use a platform to raise the money is something to consider. Actually, only 40% to date have used platforms. And when I say a platform, that is someone like Crowdfunder or FX. And that means, the majority of people aren't using platforms. So you need to think where you want to get your investment from. If you're a smaller town or village, it might be that you know most people who are likely to invest anyway. So if you're using a platform, you're paying a fee to reach people that you probably already know. If you're looking to raise a larger amount, though, and you want to raise investment from outside your immediate community and from people you don't necessarily know, then that's where a lot of platforms come into their own and provide that additional reach for you. Probably less relevant for bidding to the Community Ownership Fund is tax relief. And I say that because tax relief has certain restrictions on who can access it. And one of those restrictions is around property. But it might be worth looking at. Tax relief, we know, can be an incentive to encourage people to invest in community share offers. We have more information about that on our community shares resources online, which we'll send a link round to as well. And in the last year, we've developed new Sharia compliant model rules. So this is to encourage Muslim investment into community share offers, which in the past, as interest wasn't something that was capable of being compliant with the Muslim faith. We've developed a way where you could attract Muslim investors into a community share offer as well. So if that's something you're interested, do get in touch with us. So I've just got a few examples of community share offers who have also been awarded the Community Ownership Fund, which I thought it'd be useful just to showcase who's doing what. And we'll go through these and just look at some of the details and the numbers of what they've been doing. So this were one of the earlier ones who were awarded the Community Ownership Fund. This is Middleton Road Community Benefit Society. And this is Bowes Park in London. So this pub on the right was bought by a developer who stripped out all of the bar contents, then sought to turn into flats and didn't get planning permission and was quite rightly blocked from doing so. But you can see the state of what he left. So local people didn't like this and they agreed that they would buy it off him, but they needed to raise the money to buy it. So they were awarded Community Ownership Funds, £250,000 plus £50,000 revenue. And they were awarded that before they launched their share offer. But I think what's quite crucial here is they set up not an extensive web presence, but they set up a web presence quite nicely branded, as you can see from the image on the right. And they went out to the community, they did a number of community engagement sessions, and they got people to sign up online, pledging support that they would buy community shares when they launched the share offer. So when they came into the Community Ownership Fund, they spoke about, we're going to use our community shares money as match funding, and we're pretty confident we're going to reach that because we've already had this many people commit this much money. So that was a way around that they found of evidencing to the Community Ownership Fund they did have, or they would have, the match funding in place and able to draw it down. Ultimately, they raised £285,000, got a good reach there of almost 550 investors, and they offered 2% interest on the share offer documents that they put out. And usually a share offer would open and it would launch with a minimum amount of money to raise, an optimum amount of money to raise, and a maximum amount of money to raise. And that's a sort of stretch target at the end there. You can see the table on the left. So the maximum amount they were looking to raise was 300,000. The minimum was 200,000. And the total they needed to raise was 550. They said if they reached the maximum of 300,000 in community shares, that would give them a total of 600,000, and that would give them an extra £50,000 for refurbishments. But you can see the table on the right where all the money was going to be going, so why they needed to raise £550,000. And you have to be careful with the balance between the minimum and the maximum, because if you raise too much money, you do have to remember you have to pay this back. So you're effectively somewhat overcapitalized. So second example is Caistor District Community Trust in Lincolnshire. And the space in green on your screen was or is vacant properties at the centre of their town that was sat there, causing a bit of a blight on the local scenery. They wanted to develop this and change it and put multiple different activities into that space, including housing, shops, community facilities. So there's 5 interlinked buildings. They've sat there empty for all this time. They were awarded 225,000, so that was capital from the Community Ownership Fund, and again they were awarded some revenue money. They raised 160,000 in community shares, but that was as part of a much wider. So you can see it's actually quite a small part of their overall raise, where they raised a total of 2.4 million. And I've just put on there a little breakdown of where all the different bits of money were coming from. This one is a little bit different because at the time that they went to the Community Ownership Fund, they had a bit more of that money lined up, a bit more of the match funding, and the community shares were part of the picture in there as well. But the community shares were really the last piece of the jigsaw that they put together, and they're now tendering for the work to get the work started on site to refurbish those facilities. I should say there's a link on that one at the bottom as well, which you'll see when it comes round. But if you go to the My Community site, there's a full written up case study there as well. Community pubs are a well-trodden path and seem to be very popular with the Community Ownership Fund. A number have been supported to date and a number have used community shares. This is the George in Kent, which closed during COVID and was then put up for sale. Unfortunately, a fairly familiar story. But it was awarded £250,000 from the Community Ownership Fund. It raised 385,000 in community shares, so it raised a good amount. But it was bought, refurbished and turned around pretty quickly, so it reopened earlier this year. And again, you can see the breakdown of what they needed to raise and where they got the money from. And again, that's a mixture of community shares, grants. They got some money from our Booster programme. But they also took on some commercial lending there as well, and a small amount of crowdfunding, so non-repayable crowdfunding. And then finally, this is one which was awarded a grant in, I think it was only last week that the latest batch of Community Ownership Fund awards were made. This is York Supplies, so it's much earlier in the process really. But it was a private business founded in 1947 in the West Midlands. It's looking to exit to the community. So the owner's retiring. He doesn't really know what to do with it. The community really values it and is interested in it. We don't see too many outside of the community pubs world of private businesses being taken over by community models, but this is one. We had a similar one in Wales, Havard's Shop, the hardware store as well. So this is quite similar to that. They've come into our booster program, so they're starting to work with us now to prepare a share offer. They were awarded £300,000 just very recently. The website there is definitely worth looking at because there's a real strong call to action there of we need people involved, we need expertise, sign up to our mailing list. Trying to build that engagement with people from an early stage so you can build up a bit of an audience of who might be interested in ultimately investing in your share of them. So if I just come on to look at who community share investors are. So we know, unfortunately, that the majority aren't under 35. So it's something we're trying to encourage more younger people to look at investing in community shares. But we know that disposable income is quite challenging for everyone at the moment, but certainly for people under 35. So the majority are older people, and that's something to think about when you're planning your share offer. There's a really good balance, actually, from the research we've done of gender, of 41% of investors being female. If you look at that compared to the private investment market, so angel investors is a really tiny number of investors are female. And 55% of investors earn the average UK income or less. But the majority of investors are first-time investors as well. So that's something to think about when you're talking to people locally about a community share offer. Because you've spent the last few months reading up about community shares and preparing the offer, you might be quite familiar with it, but just remember how you're communicating about the share offer, that a lot of people won't really understand what the proposition is. You have to think how you can explain it quite quickly and succinctly to people who may not ever have invested in community shares before. We've said earlier, 80% of community share investors are primarily motivated by the wider social and environmental benefits of their investments. So if that's the last pub in your village, you're probably motivated slightly by the fact that you might get a little bit of interest on your money, but actually you're motivated by the fact that that pub is going to continue to be there, you can continue to use it, and that it might be able to develop new activities and services for your community. The 46% invest to become co-owners of the business. So a few quotes from people there about why they've invested in community shares. I wanted to keep an important music venue open. The organisation is based locally. I love the building. To combat climate change. So no one really saying I'm investing because this is purely a financial investment for me. So when it comes to understanding who might become investors and members of your society, you can see on your left some of the different categories of people who you might think about reaching out to convert to become members. We talk very much about this triangle on the right of how you build up from that wider number of people who exist in your community to the number of people that you can reach as an audience, which will be a smaller number, the number that you can convert from being your audience to being supporters, and supporters being people who you might bump into in the street who start talking about your share offer, and there's a bit of a buzz locally and they're saying, this is something I'm a bit interested in, have you heard of this? So not just people who are passively receiving the information, but people who start creating that buzz about what you're doing. And from there, you'll inevitably have a smaller number who convert to become members. And some of the maths involved here will give you an idea of how many people in your community you can ultimately convert to become members. But it's worth thinking on the left there about the different types of people you might be able to reach as well. So I'm going to just present two tables really working out how much you might be able to raise in community shares. And there are different ways of thinking about this and working this out. But just as an example, if you needed to raise £250,000, which might sit nicely with a £250,000 community ownership fund grant, how might you work out how much, how many people you need to raise, convert to investors to do that? Well, if you think about what the average investment is, now when you're talking to the community, if you hold sort of consultation sessions, you can start gauging with people how much you think they might want to invest. And if the average investment is only £100, then you know you need to reach 2,500 people to raise £250,000. That is a lot of people you need to convert. Often people need to see messages a number of times as well before they finally push the buy button. Most share offers will launch with a bit of a flurry of activity. They'll have then a bit of a plateau of death where nothing seems to happen for a number of weeks. And then as soon as there's a bit of a deadline, you see a bit of a flurry as all the comms come to place. As people have received that message a number of times, finally get round to pulling out their bank card or however they're going to pay for it and finally make that investment. I think people mull these things over until the last minute and do need a bit of a deadline. But equally, if the average investment is £1,000, you might only need to reach 250 people. And while it's great to have 2,500 people as members of your society, that's great from an engagement perspective and an ongoing governance perspective and a reach perspective. It is a much harder job to reach that number of people, but it is a really hard job to get 250 people to buy £1,000 worth of shares as well. So one other way of thinking about it is supposing you're based in a town or a village with a 5,000 population. So if you're thinking we need to raise £250,000, not everyone is necessarily going to be based locally within that village, but let's estimate that 80% of the people who buy shares are going to be living locally. So that means we need to raise £200,000 from the local community. If we think we've got a population of 5,000, we need to then start looking at what is the population of people who are old enough to buy community shares. So have a look at your rules and see what your rules say on who's eligible to buy community shares by age. So that might reduce down to only 4,000 people. Now, if we've got 4,000 people, we go back to our chart before, we've got those as the people at the bottom of the triangle. It's how many people are still there at the top of the triangle. Well, if it's only 2%, so if we're only converting 2% of those people, that means we need 80 people. So the average investment there might be £2,500. If we're able to convert 5% of the people, then that's 200 people that we would have. That would reduce the average investment down to £1,000. So you can do a little bit of maths here to try and gauge both what the average investment might be. You can gauge how much the minimum investment might be. You can also start to think, how much can we raise? How much do we need to raise? But also, how do we reach people, and how many people do we need to reach? So if you need to reach 80 to 200 people, you need to think how many people are on your mailing list. You need to think, how many people are following you on social media? How many people do you collectively know? How many people are you going to put postcards through their letterbox, etc.? So I'll pause there. If I come on to you, are you there?
Absolutely. If John, you could do the slides. Could you start my video for me? I can't at the moment, so nobody can see who's been making all this noise in the background. I'm really sorry about that, everybody. My mum, who qualified for Wimbledon in 1942, is quite deaf, and she's watching Wimbledon at the moment, hence the background noise. So my apologies for that. So John, I think you need to start my video, or I can just carry on silently.
Carry on, Rose. I'm struggling to work out how to do it, to be honest, but I'll persevere.
Okay. I think it's probably something that just allows you to click. Anyway, I shall carry on if you could. Lovely. So there's quite a lot of background information you can find that will really help you understand more about community shares. The Community Shares Handbook provides a wealth of information. It tells you about what share capital is, what kind of legislation you need, whether you need to be a CBS or a charitable CBS or a co-op, helps you understand the registration process, what needs to be included in offer documents, how you can promote your offers. It tells you a little bit about share interest and how it can be used, profit or surplus, and a lot about regulation and guidance and tax treatment as well. So it's an invaluable resource. It is quite a tough read, which is why we have community shares practitioners to help you through understanding all of that. And then the community standard mark, what it is, it's a framework that for societies to develop a really high quality share offer that is clear and transparent and accurate and gives people an easy to read understanding of what they're actually looking to invest in. It's very detailed, and it really helps you dot the I's and cross the T's of your share offer. And we have community shares practitioners can help you produce your share offer document. And then to get the standard mark, it has to be independently assessed by an accredited community shares practitioner. And then you can stamp that on your share offer document. And as John said, having that gives real confidence to investors that this document is something that can be trusted and presents information accurately. The expert practitioners will pop onto the next slide to see that. But the case studies, we've seen a few of those. We have many case studies of the whole range of share offers that we've done, that includes shops, pubs, refurbishment of great big old buildings, swimming pools, skate parks, community parks, housing. There's a whole raft of stuff, and it's really good looking at those case studies to get a feel for what they did and what really worked. And of course, you can sign up to the newsletter to hear about what's going on. John, if we could look at the next slide, please. So this is our lovely range of friendly practitioners. There are many more than you can see on the screen. You're completely at liberty to just click on the links to each of the individuals. You can search on region, you can search on particular expertise. All of their contact details are supplied. All of them will be willing to have a chat with you if you just want to explore an idea, just without any charge. But if you start using them in earnest for a number of days, you'll need to pay for their services, and these can be included in the grants, which we can come on to. If you could look at the next slide, please. And wherever you are, there is support available. Community Shares Scotland, Morven and Toby and probably others whose names I can't remember at the moment, are based there. It's based with Development Trust Association Scotland, tremendous understanding of knowledge of the local situation there. Wales and also Northern Ireland have specific places you can go to for support. We in Co-ops UK support England only, and we'll run on to what we're able to. John, did you want to add something there?
No, it's fine. Keep going, Rose.
I just thought you appeared. So we'll look to see specifically what Booster offers, which only operates in England. We'd love to be working over the whole country because this is such a wonderful thing to have. So John, if we could look at the next slide, please. So the Booster Fund in its latest form is really, as we say here, a one-stop shop for a whole range of different pots of money that do slightly different things. And there's more money than there was available before. We have grants up to 10,000 K, usually average 5 to 7K, and there's more equity available. The average is, yeah, I'd say 50 to 60, and can go up as much as 100K. Some instances, possibly a little higher than that. But we're really thrilled to have this additional funding available. And then there's some other, over and beyond the equity and the grants, there are some other types of funding available. John, I think we've got those on the next slide. First we'll go through what we can offer. Oh yes, no, these are there. So as well as the ordinary grants, which I'll go into a little more detail about, we can offer some pre-grant support. So if you're appointed, those who sort of ticked, they know a little bit when Don did his pre-questions, you're probably the people who might need this, where you're not quite sure what community shares are, you know a bit about them, you think they might be something you want to use. That's the chance to use the pre-grant support. It's a really simple application form. It just says one off question, you know, what do you want the money for, basically. It would help us enormously to know what you're doing as well as what you need the money for. And the kind of things we supported people to do is to get advice from a practitioner for a couple of days to help scope out what your capital need is for the project you have in mind and where community shares might fit in, and what you need to do next if community shares are what you want to look to. And also just things like understanding your legal structure. And if you are, for example, a CIO, which isn't able to issue community shares and you want to convert, or you might need to set up a subsidiary, we can link you up with some support to help you through that stage, just so you have a better understanding of what it is you'd be embarking on if you did community shares. Another really useful thing is something offered by Cooperative and Community Finance, which is subscription underwriting, where you have people with less disposable income who would really love to invest in your shares that say can't afford, say, £100 or a £250 share. They could get one and pay it off over 10 months, say, so £10 a month for £10, or for 10 months, or £25 a month. And what CCF does will underwrite that sum. They'll pay that money up front, and then you can pay them back over time as those subscription comes in. And what it does, it'll make many more opportunities for people on lesser incomes, or as I say, with less disposable finance, to invest. And the other thing available is a loan from Cooperative and Community Finance, which is something that'll sit alongside the share offer and just top something up. And it's 75K or perhaps up to 150K with variable interest rates. And all of that can be accessible just through the one grant application you make to us. So could we go to the next slide? So eligibility. You must be based in England to apply to the Booster Fund, and you must have charitable purposes, which doesn't mean you have to be a charity, but it does mean that your project or your organization must have very clear reasons for clearly be able to demonstrate what benefits they are bringing to those communities that are charitable. You must be trading or have a trading model, because you're going to need to demonstrate that over a period of time you'll be generating enough surplus or profit to be able to pay interest if you're paying it, and to pay back those shares when you're in a position to do so. And if you're not already a community benefit society, a charitable community benefit society or co-op, you must be willing or able to convert to one or set up a subsidiary that is one of those things. And there's help to do all of that. And you must be exploring or aiming to issue a community share offer, or you've already, even if you've already launched one, you can still apply to Booster because there's a grant element as well as the equity element. Now, our funders have particular priorities, as do we. We're building a portfolio of shares, and it's getting quite large now. John, I think, have we made something like 72 investments? But we're very aware that there's an imbalance in the share offers that we have made in the past, and we're trying to redress that balance by creating many more opportunities and to try and include people who are more diverse. And we're trying to get applications from underrepresented communities and the use of community shares. So we're targeting areas that are quite disadvantaged where we can, where people are facing systemic inequality. Minority ethnicities have often been excluded. And we're working very hard to find ways to be inclusive, because what we understand is many groups are not accustomed to filling in application forms or just have a different way of thinking about things. So a lot of what we're trying to do is to find ways of enabling people to apply where the process isn't easy for them. We're looking at indices of multiple deprivations, areas 1 to 3, which doesn't mean we exclude groups that are working in areas outside that, but those are the ones that we prioritize. We're really keen to work with community business that embrace diverse leadership. So where there is a real diversity in their community, we would like to see that community represented on their board or in the leadership of the projects they're doing. Where there is not a very diverse community, we still expect what community there is there to be represented in the projects you're doing. And younger people, 35 years and under, we're really trying to embrace, look for projects that enable younger people to get involved with the whole process, participate in the leadership of the organization, sit on the board, and actually invest in the community share issue. And that's where something like the subscription shares or pay it forward, that kind of thing is really helpful. Tackling the climate crisis is a hugely important thing these days, and anything that applicants can demonstrate they're doing, whether it's refurbishing their buildings, trying to work down to carbon zero, encouraging their community to participate in anything that is going to be a positive impact, improvements to the environment around them, really needs to be demonstrated in applications. Digital transformation is another important thing. How can you help communities access the internet, through the projects you're doing, in the technology that you're using yourselves? How can you create opportunities like hot desking and all sorts of things that enable people to function in the world that we live in these days? And all of these things, you may not, these may not be uppermost in what you're doing, but if you're not able to hit some of these priorities or evidence them in your application forms, your chances of getting grants or equity are much less. But the panel really reads everything with great care, and considers every application on its own merits. But really big word of advice to try and hit those priorities or demonstrate how you do that. Pardon me, I'm going to cough. I shall just mute for a minute. The best place to find out a lot of information about the fund is on our website, www.uk.co Booster Fund. Really recommend you read the application fund guidance. It's laid out very carefully, and you can see exactly what questions you'll be asked, as well as acquire an understanding of how to apply and what support there is. As soon as you're ready, complete the Booster Fund expression of interest. That's a panel of Cooperatives UK and the funders, and we just look to see if projects are eligible, and then how they might reach priorities. But if you do that, it's fairly straightforward. We try to respond in a couple of weeks. If you're a really early stage, as I said before, and you're not quite sure, you have some notion of what community shares are about, but don't really know enough to feel you can go ahead with them, do please complete a pre-grant request form. It's very straightforward. I receive those and I can usually respond in a few days and let you know if there's anything we can do to help. And just get in touch, whatever stage you're at, and you're not sure about the application process. We'll do everything we can to support you. And there's our generic email, communityshares@uk.coop, which we all keep an eye on. So all very happy to respond and help. So the team you're talking to, John is our boss. He sort of really heads up the community shares unit. Isla McCulloch is charge of the community standard mark and can answer any queries about that. I deal with all the pre-grants and grants, and my colleague Alice Wharton deals with all the equity requests and overall in charge of the program. So hopefully you can find everything you need, but please don't hesitate to get in touch if there's anything we can do to help. And there we are, I think. Do we have any other questions?
These are contact details, so that Linktree link will take you to the Community Shares website and Cooperatives UK's websites. There's the email address if you want to contact us via that very old-fashioned thing these days of Twitter. There's the ComShares account on there as well. We will send around these slides to attendees afterwards. They'll also be put up on the My Community website, as will a recording of today.